Route 30, a short story by Tom Hart. It was cold for this time of year, clear-skied and freezing. The long drive made easier by the old country radio and that drop of whiskey in my overnight flask. It was rare to see other drivers, maybe passing one every 3 or 4 miles. But that's why we take the job, you know? The isolation's part of the appeal. I'd had a bit of trouble with one of the tyres a few hours previously. The rain had been coming down thick and I completely missed the pothole. It had been losing air since and was overdue for a change. I've always hated changing flats at night, especially on this road. There was something about the way the trees lined up so perfectly on either side. Something about the blackness between the trunks that was just so oppressive. And this night was no different. I pulled the truck over, grabbed my gloves, my flask and a torch, and set about changing the tyre. The bull in flowery apron cooking over a barbecue that was the Matix Meat Company logo stared down at me as I removed the lug nuts. The cold was biting now. It stung me even through my layers. The headlights cast an eerie spotlight over the road and tree line ahead, and the darkness almost seemed to push back with creeping tendrils. The way the light weaved in between the trees always terrified me. Though I knew there were only elk out here, no chance of bears this close to the road. I remember a couple of years back, on a similar night to this, an elk darted out in front of my cab. The impact crushed its skull, and must have killed it instantly, but one of its antlers got caught in the radiator grate. I had to stop and pull it out and drag the poor broken thing to the side of the road. It cost me half a week's pay to get the blood washed out of the grill, and the whole thing shook me up something fierce. But there were no elk tonight, just the silence, and before long a newly fitted tyre. On the way back up to the cab I spotted a pair of headlights coming down the road about a mile away. It was a bit overdue. I took a quick swig from my flask and climbed back up into the truck, the twang of whiskey stinging my throat. By the time I'd set down the flask, taken off my gloves and put the keys in the ignition, I looked up the road out of force of habit. The headlights I'd seen weren't there anymore. Strange, as this road was straight for another couple 100 miles. But maybe there'd been a road constructed out into the forest since my last trip down here. There had been a pretty big push for lumber recently. Not that that mattered. Far stranger things have happened on roads like these. Still, I found some comfort in the dull drone of the country music pushing itself lazily out from my speakers. 15 minutes or so later and I was sure I'd passed the point where I'd seen the car in the distance. I'd been keeping a close eye on the trees and I was certain I'd seen no side roads or dirt paths that a car could have driven down. I don't know, maybe I just imagined it. The light does play weird tricks out here, especially at this time of night. A little too much of the old homebrew, maybe. It was pushing 3, maybe 4 AM at this point, and I could feel the weight of my eyes a little more than I was comfortable with. But there was something about the whole disappearing car act that made me want to keep on down the road for a spell. So that's what I did, for another 10 or so miles. Somewhere down the road, the station I was listening to decided it would be a good time to switch hosts. And I decided it would be a good time to switch stations. I took another gulp of homebrew and started fiddling with the dial. I swear, I only took my eyes off the road for a second. When I looked back up, I had to swerve hard to the left to avoid a suited man in the middle of the road. I barely managed to keep control and nearly collided with the tree line. I braked so hard that the glove compartment busted open and sprayed leather change and fast food boxes all over the floor. But screw that. I reached into the compartment and belted the gun inside. Took another swig of homebrew for courage and popped the door of my cab, ready for a seriously heated conversation with this arsehole. But there was nothing or no one there but the moon over the trees, the blinking red and yellow brake lights and the pungent smell of hot rubber on tarmac. I did a full 360 of the truck, gun in hand, shaking in anger and fear. But the man was gone. The strange, suited man, featureless, tall and gaunt. His image burned into my retinas as if I'd stared at the sun for too long. He had disappeared without a trace. I don't know, maybe I'd imagined him. I was getting real tired and I was far too spooked to be standing in the middle of the road like an idiot. I jumped back in the cab, got on the seat beside me, and brought the truck back onto the road, speeding off as fast as I could. Maybe I was just mistaken. Maybe I was hallucinating. Too much homebrew, too tired. I should have taken a pit stop by now. In the car? The disappearing car? I must just be having an off day. Maybe this job's getting to me. Too much stress, too much time alone. Maybe I need a break. I need to sleep. I'm hallucinating. I'm going crazy. I took another gulp of homebrew and carried on down the long road for miles and miles, until the pitch black of night started to soften into the warm purple of morning. Still completely shaken, I pulled the truck over, down the last few drops of homebrew, and collapsed into my chair in complete exhaustion. When I awoke a few hours later, the sun had fully crested the road ahead of me. Morning light pierced the cab as I squinted and lowered the sun visor. I had a splitting headache. Maybe I'd necked more whiskey than I thought. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. I sat there for a while, nervously playing with my gloves and staring out ahead of me. A couple of cars passed as I sat still just off the road. Eventually, after a few swigs of water this time, I plugged up courage enough to get back onto the road. But something was wrong. The pressure on the suspension didn't feel quite right. As if all the weight had been... I started another 360 of the truck, but stopped short as I reached the rear end. The doors of the cargo container were torn to shreds. One had been ripped almost in half and thrown aside onto the road. The other hung limply from one hinge, like a broken arm yet to be cast. Nearly every meat hook in the container was empty. Some still held large chunks, as if the meat hanging there had been ripped down, not properly removed. Torn sheets of metal littered the grassy bank, and several dark red and viscous trails led off into the forest beyond. That was enough for me. I stumbled backwards, tripping over my own feet and slamming into the ground so hard that I clamped halfway down through my tongue. I climbed back into the cab and drove as fast and as far away as I could. I quit my job shortly after, and I've never driven back to Route 30 since. The faceless man is now a regular visitor in my dreams. His image is clear and uncanny as it was that night, and I fear that it's getting clearer. An Idle Tuesday by Tom Hart. It was a Tuesday morning when we first noticed the statues. Cold, unmoving obelisks of otherworldly stone. They seemed to appear as if from nowhere, but evoked an uncanny impression of normality, as if they'd always been there, a part of our lives, as mundane as the benches and fire hydrants we pass on our way to work. We were scared at first. I remember the news reports, the crowds that gathered in parks and on hillsides to stare bewildered at them. I remember the nervous murmurings and barking dogs. I remember the feeling of deep unease that gripped me when I looked at them for too long. But it wasn't long before our fear faded and was replaced by our innate curiosity. We stopped fearing them and began to wonder where they came from, what they were made of and who was responsible, how they got there and why they were here. We tested, poked and prodded, but we found nothing. They were made from no known substance, their qualities matched no metal or mineral. They appeared like stone, granite-like in appearance and texture, yet were warm to the touch and reacted with variances in heat when struck or exposed to liquid. Soon after, curiosity was replaced by defeat, then defeat replaced by disdain. We trained ourselves to forget that they existed, passed them by on our way to work like the benches and the fire hydrants. And we went on like that. We learned to avoid looking at them. We pushed the unease and fear from our minds and simply got on with it. And that was fine. Before long, the uncanny sense of unease seemed to disappear. We didn't even need to ignore them anymore. We became almost comfortable with them. We sat picnics round them, posed for selfies with them. A group of enthusiasts even started a religion devoted to them. And that was fine too. I remember when the first few died. We denied it at first, brushed it off as the devoted few taking their zealotry too far. We thought that they'd killed themselves in some act of sacrifice or piety. So we banned it, outlawed the religion, threatened weighty sentences for any found worshipping them. But it kept happening. People were just shutting down, their bodies giving up for no tangible reason, save for their proximity to them. It didn't take long for panic to begin. We quickly quarantined them, banned all access to them, and started to discuss solutions. We took the bulldozers to them first. We dug as far as we could, but they were entrenched so deep into the earth that eventually we just couldn't dig anymore. Then we tried force, weaponry, explosives, strongly worded letters. All were useless. That was when the headaches started. There wasn't a family that didn't lose a father or daughter then. Chronic headaches descending slowly into complete mental decay. Sons forgot their mothers, their names, and eventually simply faded away into complete vacancy. Their eyes devoid of anything that made them who they once were. By the time the birds started falling from the sky and the trees began to wither and die, we had exhausted all ideas and possible defenses against them. Mass evacuations were carried out, but it didn't matter. Wherever we went, they were always there, watching in unmoving silence. I remember the anger, the confusion, the desperate leaders of the world flailing for a solution. I remember the debates, the rage, and the vitriol. How quickly allied nations turned their backs on one another. I remember when the first bomb dropped, when the first city was leveled. How easily the cost of human lives was forgotten. I remember how we mourned as one by one nations of the world were lost. I remember a war with no sides, no winners or losers. And I remember when the war ended, when there were no more bombs left, when the streets and parks we used to walk through on our way to work were littered with bodies. I remember the day the lights went out, the day of the final broadcast. And then one day, they were just gone. The statue had served their purpose, their silent invasion complete and perfect. It was a Tuesday morning when we noticed they'd left us.